in South Africa in 2012. So I lived in South Africa. My student visa was January to June 2012. It goes in one of these, a passport. So I was United States of America passport at the time. And mine was 6 months. So what was it like getting it? I'm going to start off with there are 4 broadly kind of visas slash travel slash immigration slash immigration. 4 really broad categories, 3 which I've experience with. So at the base level, there's just having a passport, and this suffices. No visa is necessary to travel to a country. I've experienced that when I went to Scotland, the United Kingdom, Scotland. They just scanned my passport, and I didn't need a tourist visa or anything like that, and didn't have to buy one at the border or that kind of thing. Up above that, in terms of duration, is a tourist visa. So I've known people, or know of people, who will go and volunteer in a country for 2 months, and a tourist visa tends to cover kind of like a really short visit to up to 2 months. It's some sort of verification that the person's in the country, more than just kind of scanning their passport. My family and I got those, which we bought at the border and kind of had to fill out paperwork for when we went to the Dominican Republic, which is part of an island in the Caribbean. So my family and I did that for that trip, and that was 2007, if I'm recalling correctly. And Scotland was 2019. And then 2012 was a student visa. So they're called extended stay visas. So the minimum was like 2 or 3 months up to 6 months. And then but one could also do like a year-long visa. I did the 6-month visa. And then if one wants to extend their visa, you can apply once you have that visa. And then the 4th kind of tier, which I have not done, is immigration. So that'd be like if I immigrated to a different country. So if I emigrated from United States, immigrating to another country, there's paperwork / visa, depending on what one's ancestry and or residential status. It might actually be a passport for that country, as opposed to a visa, that kind of thing. So I have not done that one. I've done the other 3. And so specifically the extended stay visa, the 6-month visa, it took, if I'm recalling correctly, it took about, there's an application process. It's very reliant on paperwork and paper documentation. I was required to send in my passport along with other documents, such as, so I was studying abroad, doing a exchange, which means I went and studied at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University and from the University of Washington, and then a student from Africa took my spot at the University of Washington, so we switched spots. And I had to have paperwork from both the University of Washington and the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in South Africa. So there's no, this is something that's very much reliant on reality and documentation. So verbal commitments, no good, kind of thing. They're not up to snuff in the level of commitment needed. I was required to send in my passport. I had other identity documents I had to send in. And then how it works is there's, I think it's the consulate. So there are different regions. For South Africa, I had to send it to the South Africa consulate or embassy or something like that in the United States for South Africa. So I had to find one of those, and they were divided based on region. And there were a few of them, and per one's region, so Washington State fell in some region, I would send it to the headquarters for my region, all of my documentation and stuff. And the wait time could be, they said to send it in really far in advance. Wait times could be 3 or 4 months to get the visa cleared. So this is not a tourist visa. It's not like I'm going someplace and performing as part of a concert, or like that's kind of one that was pretty common for some people who are band or orchestra. They would go someplace for a week or 2 and perform. and they might need a tourist visa, but they didn't ever have to go through the 6-month extended stay process. And so for them, it was pretty straightforward. For something like a student visa, it matters that wait time because you have to. I had to send my passport in, so that means I couldn't travel internationally during the time my application for my student visa was being processed and granted. And it took me. So they said at that point in time, if I'm recalling correctly, it was communicated, expect up to 3 to 4 months. Mine processed and was sent back to me with the student visa in it. So they make the student visa, if you get approved, they make the student visa and they put it in your passport. So when my passport and stuff came back to me, I had the student visa was inside the passport on one of the pages. And then I was good to go. And I think it was copies I sent. So I sent the passport and they might have asked for original documentation. Some of it might have been copies and then they kept the copies but sent the passport back. Something like that. And this was over a decade ago because I left for Africa in January and returned at the end of June. So I kind of, in terms of months, I maxed out my student visa. And I started the application process in... Anything else to know? Yeah. So I was going to Africa, which required vaccinations for diseases that do not exist in the United States of America. And whether or not one has proof of there's kind of, it's a linked process, because if you're going, when are you coming back? When do we do your TB test? Are you going to do your TB test when you get back? So there's also stuff that does exist, but because one's traveling to a part of the world where diseases are in high enough abundance compared to the United States of America, there are also, in addition to vaccinations, there were tests, so tuberculosis tests required before and after. And that's actually part of the requirement of travel. And so that was linked with the student visa. There's a kind of we're not going to commit to do this unless you have intent to travel. So if I have my student visa, I can show the range and they can be like, okay, we can approve you to get this vaccine, or we can approve you to get this test because you have the student visa. So having the student visa and giving oneself enough time for it to process is kind of necessary. I started the process in 2011, so the year before I went, in the fall winter. Not too far in advance, but in advance nonetheless. And then, and this is if I'm recalling correctly, and because I was like concerned, I was like, what if I don't get it back in time? What if I don't get my visa in time to go? But I was fine and they did good. And is there anything else? It was a really... I think people can read stuff online from these official government agencies and they're like, can I trust this? And it's kind of, well, if one's applying for a visa in another country and they're not trusting that government and the government of one's own country, perhaps one shouldn't be going. That's just a reality check. And so I didn't ever have those problems and I didn't question it, and things went fine and faster even than was posted online. So just being cognizant of these organizations have put time into putting this information out there for people applying for the visas. They're not intentionally doing it wrong. They're doing it to help you. So maybe trying to be trustful, even if one's not a trustful person. I tend to be a trustful person, and so it wasn't a problem for me. But there are people in this world who, and like people I met in Africa who were like, oh my gosh, but how do I know if it's right? And like they took so long, even though like it would be faster than was posted online, and they'd still complain about it being long and stuff like that. And some people are just natural born complainers. No matter how things go in their life, whether it's for them or against them, they'll complain. I'm not one of those persons. I'm not one of those people. I was very happy. I was ecstatic. I was like, oh my gosh, this took like a fraction of the time they'd post it online. So yeah, I was happy, and it worked out for me. So, and I chose not to extend it. I do know one person from the United States of America who, when they were there, they got the 6-month visa, and then they went to the embassy, the United States of America embassy in South Africa, and got it extended for another 6 months. So they stayed a year. So it is possible, once one has a student visa, it is possible to extend it or get a different, like another 6-month student visa. You still have to be a student, from the people I know who went through the paperwork. And again, I think they had to send in their passport. So you kind of, if you're doing that, or relinquishing one's passport for a period of time, there's if you're in the country, so if you're in South Africa, or like the person was in South Africa, they didn't get to travel for that period of time. And there's a bit of, when one's an international living in South Africa, we were required to show passports when we booked hotels and stuff like that, or a hostel. We were required to show our passports as identification. So it not only restricts travel outside the country, but within the country as well. So that's just something to be cognizant of, is travel's kind of extremely restricted if one waits to apply for a second visa or another visa in that country. From my experience with people who went through that kind of at the time, it might be different now because that was 2012, January to June 2012. But that was my experience with getting the visa, and kind of, a tourist visa, so I mentioned that I got that for the Dominican Republic. That one, so that's the one that's up to, can be up to 2 months, the short-term visit in another country. I also had that when I was traveling around Southern Africa, so not just South Africa. My student visa was some sort of saving grace when I went to Zimbabwe and Zambia with one of my friends, coming back to South Africa, we were actually allowed to enter the country through the South African residence, versus someone from the United States of America who had just a tourist visa. If they did the same thing, they would have had to go through non-South Africa residents. So we did have an expedited re-entry to South Africa if we left the country kind of process because of the student visa. So there's that perk too. Zimbabwe required the tourist visa, so I did get that. And that was 2012. But that is on getting a 6-month student visa when I lived in South Africa, January to June 2012.